The sun didn't rise that morning so much as it attacked. It came over the rim of the Arizona Canyon like something that had been waiting, patient, merciless, ancient. And it found Vera Holt exactly where it had left her the night before, on her knees, in the dirt. Her hands wrapped around a stone, scraping letters into the face of a boulder that would never mark any grave. E-M-M-E. Not a memorial. Memorials were for people who had somewhere to put them. She had nothing, no plot, no churchyard, no town that wanted her name spoken inside its limits anymore. She had a dying horse, a canteen with a dry echo at the and a letter she had read so many times the fold lines were beginning to tear. She pressed her palm flat against the carved letters and held it there. Behind her she heard Cinder shift his weight, that slow, painful drag of his injured leg across the cracked earth. He had no business still standing. Neither did she, but he was. And so because the horse had not yet decided to quit, Vera Holt decided she hadn't either. She tucked the letter back inside her coat against her chest directly over her heart. Follow Cinder. He knows the way. She didn't know where he was taking her. She only knew she had nothing left to lose by finding out. The sun didn't rise that morning so much as it attacked. It came over the rim of the Arizona Canyon like something that had been waiting, patient, merciless, ancient. And it found Vera Holt exactly where it had left her the night before, on her knees, in the dirt. Her hands wrapped around a stone, scraping letters into the face of a boulder that would never mark any grave. E-M-M. Not a memorial. Memorials were for people who had somewhere to put them. She had nothing, no plot, no churchyard, no town that wanted her name spoken inside its limits anymore. She had a dying horse, a canteen with a dry echo at the bottom, and a letter she had read so many times the fold lines were beginning to tear. She pressed her palm flat against the carved letters and held it there. The rock was already warm. By midday it would be hot enough to blister skin. That was the Arizona desert in the summer of 1886, a place that did not tolerate sentiment, did not accommodate grief, and did not slow its killing for anyone, widow or otherwise. Behind her she heard Cinder shift his weight, that slow, painful drag of his injured leg across the cracked earth, a sound she had memorized over the past 2 days, the specific rhythm of it, the solid strike of his 3 good hooves. The hesitant scrape of the 4th had become the metronome of her survival. When she stopped hearing it, she knew she would know something final had been decided. But she still heard it. So she pressed harder against the carved letters, feeling the rough edges bite into her palm, and she made herself remember. Emmett Holt had been 38 years old when the fever took him. Not a dramatic death, not a heroic one. He had simply grown quieter over the course of a week, then quieter still until one gray morning in October he had stopped making any sound at all. Vera had been sitting beside him when it happened, holding his hand, talking to him about the garden she wanted to plant in spring. Tomatoes. She had wanted tomatoes. He had smiled at that, or she believed he had. She chose to believe he had. The funeral had been small. Emmett had not been a man of large gestures or loud friendships. He had been steady, the kind of man whose value you only fully understood when the steadiness was gone, and you felt the ground shift beneath you. She had understood it the morning after they put him in the ground. And she had understood it even more clearly 3 weeks later, standing in the front room of the Holt family house, watching her father-in-law, Arden, fold his hands on the table with the careful deliberateness of a man who had rehearsed this moment. Arden Holt was 64 years old and had been the largest landowner in Caldera Creek, Arizona, for 30 years. He had built his reputation the way men of his generation built everything, through absolute certainty, that his judgment was correct and everyone else's was irrelevant. He had a face like weathered sandstone, all sharp planes and deep lines, with eyes the color of old iron that had never in Vera's 5 years of knowing him softened into anything approaching warmth. He had tolerated her because Emmett loved her. With Emmett gone, the tolerance had an expiration date, and apparently 3 weeks was it. "This house belongs to the Holt family," he had said, not looking at her. "The land, the cattle, the water rights, all of it passes through Emmett's bloodline, which you did not provide." Vera had sat very still. She had known this conversation was coming. She had felt it building the way you feel a storm, building the pressure, dropping the air, going strange, the quality of silence shifting into something loaded and dangerous. "I have nowhere to go," she said, not pleading, simply stating fact. "That is not my concern." Corbett, Emmett's older brother, sat in the corner chair and studied the floor. He was 40 years old and had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes and absolutely none of either parent's backbone. He did not look at Vera. He had not looked at her directly in 3 weeks. She understood that his silence was a kind of answer, the answer of a man who had already made his choice and found it easier to make it without witnesses. Selma Corbett's wife sat beside him with their daughter Wren pressed against her side. Wren was 7 years old and did not understand what was happening except that the adults in the room were very still in the way that meant something bad. She kept looking at Vera with her large, serious eyes, and Vera kept not looking back because if she looked at that child, she was going to lose the composure she needed to get through the next 10 minutes. "I'll take whatever is fair," Vera said to Arden. "I'm not asking for charity, just for what Emmett would have wanted." Something crossed Arden's face at the mention of his son's name, something quick and painful that he closed off before it could become readable. What Emmett would have wanted is not the point. Then what is? He stood. The conversation was over. He had decided it was over, so it was. "You can take the black horse. He's injured, won't be useful to us. There's a day's worth of food in the saddlebag and some water." He moved toward the door and stopped with his back to her. "Go west. There's nothing north or south worth finding. Don't come back to Caldera Creek." He walked out. Corbett finally looked up. For one moment his eyes met hers and she saw something in them, shame, or the precursor to shame, the place where shame lives, before a man is brave enough to let it become action. He opened his mouth, then he closed it, and looked back at the floor. Selma made a small sound that might have been the beginning of a protest or might have been nothing. Little Wren reached out and touched Vera's hand very gently. The way children touch things they know are fragile. Vera stood, smoothed her dress, and walked out to meet what was left of her life. Cinder was tied to the post outside. He was a large horse, had been a magnificent horse once. Vera had no doubt of that. Emmett had loved him with a straightforward, uncomplicated tenderness that Vera had always found quietly moving. Men who were good to their horses she had always believed were men you could trust with more important things. Emmett had brushed Cinder every evening, talked to him while he worked, given him the best of the feed, even in lean seasons. Arden had given her Emmett's horse. She might have found that meaningful, even kind, if she had not noticed in the first moments of checking the saddlebags the small brown glass bottle tucked beneath the folded cloth. She held it up, turned it in the light. The liquid inside was dark, viscous, with a faint chemical smell that she recognized dimly from a conversation Emmett had once had with the farrier about animals that needed to be put down slowly without pain. Her hands went very still. She looked at Cinder, at the way he held his injured leg, not the casual favoring of a minor wound, but the careful, constant guarding of something that had been genuinely damaged. And she thought about how the injury had happened. Arden had told her Cinder stumbled on rocky ground 2 days before Emmett died. An accident. A piece of bad luck in an already unlucky season. She thought about that. She looked at the bottle again. Then she tucked it into her coat pocket, untied Cinder's reins, and began to walk west. She was not going to waste time on what she could not prove. She was going to survive. That was the only answer she had left, and she was going to make it count. For the first hour, she walked beside Cinder rather than riding him. His leg needed whatever relief she could offer, and she needed the motion, the simple physical act of putting one foot in front of another, the body's argument against despair. The land around Caldera Creek was high desert scrub brush and red rock, and the occasional skeletal silhouette of a saguaro standing against the sky like a penitent. She had come to love this landscape in 5 years of living inside it. Its harshness had never frightened her the way it frightened some of the women who came west from softer country. But she had never been alone in it before. She had never been in it with nothing at her back. By midday, she had eaten half the food and rationed herself to 2 small sips of water. The canteen was light in her hand, disturbingly light, the weight of it communicating a message she preferred not to translate into specific hours of survival. She tried not to translate it. Cinder walked beside her without complaint. His head was down, but his ears were working, moving constantly, parsing the desert sounds with a methodical attention that she found despite everything reassuring. He was listening. Whatever pain he was in, whatever damage had been done to his leg, he was still fully present to the world around him, still engaged. She thought about Emmett. It was a thought she had been trying to discipline since the funeral, trying to keep it in its proper place and not let it flood the available space the way grief tends to do if you give it any opening. But out here, with nothing to look at but rock and sky and the faithful plodding form of the horse her husband had loved, the thought wouldn't be managed. Emmett had been good. That was the word she kept returning to. Not brilliant, not extraordinary in any of the ways that made men famous or important. Just good. Reliable as sunrise. Solid as the sandstone walls of the canyon country he'd grown up in. He had looked at Vera when they met, when they married, on every ordinary morning of their years together with the same steady, uncomplicated certainty. Like the answer to a question he'd asked a long time ago and never needed to ask again. She had not understood when she had it, how rare that was. She understood now. The afternoon brought a wind off the higher elevations to the north, not cooling exactly, but stirring the dead air into something that felt slightly less like the inside of a furnace. She found a formation of rocks that threw a shadow long enough to shelter in for 20 minutes, shared the shade with Cinder, drank another small mouthful of water, and allowed herself the specific luxury of sitting down. It was in the shade of those rocks that she took out the letter. She had found it tucked inside the saddlebag beneath the bottle. It was folded 3 times and sealed with a small wax drop, not an official seal, just the impression of Emmett's thumb. She had seen him do that before, pressing his thumb into cooling wax to close things. Letters to the cattle buyers, notes to the farrier, small transactions of a working life. She had opened it the first night after leaving Caldera Creek, read it by the light of a fire she'd built from scrub brush, and then folded it carefully back along its original lines and tucked it against her chest. Now she unfolded it again. The handwriting was Emmett's. She would have known it among 1,000 hands, the particular way he made his letters, slightly compressed, leaning forward as if they were all moving towards something. The paper was good quality, better than he usually used for ordinary correspondence. He had thought about this letter. He had prepared it. She read it for what she estimated was the 15th time. Vera, if you're reading this, then what I was afraid might happen has happened, and I'm sorry I'm not there to stand between you and it. I knew my father, I loved him, and I knew him, and I should have done more while I was alive to build you a better protection than the one I managed. I'm sorry for that too. I need you to trust Cinder. I know how that sounds. But there is a place. I found it a long time ago when I was 18 and foolish and got myself lost for 3 days in the canyon country west of Caldera Creek. A place that saved my life once. I have never told anyone about it because it felt like the kind of thing that ought to be kept quiet, kept safe, kept for when it was truly needed. I think it's needed now. Follow Cinder. He's been there. He knows the way better than any map I could draw you. I've seen horses remember water from years past from distances that shouldn't be possible. Trust his instincts over your fear. I left something there for you. You'll know it when you find it. I love you. I loved you from the first morning, and I will love you past the last one. Emmett. She held the letter for a long time without reading it, just holding it, feeling the weight of the paper in her hands. Then she folded it carefully, tucked it back against her chest, stood up, brushed the red dust off her skirt, and looked at Cinder. He had raised his head while she read. He was looking west-northwest, now his ears forward, and locked his nostrils, testing the air with a focused intentionality that was different from his earlier casual scanning. Something had shifted in his attention. Something deliberate had replaced the passive endurance of the past several hours. "All right," Vera said. "You heard that?" He didn't look at her. He kept looking at whatever he was looking at, somewhere beyond the visible horizon, beyond the shimmer and the rock and the baking empty distance. "All right," she said again, "then lead." She mounted him carefully, favoring his injured leg, settling her weight as evenly as she could manage. He moved immediately, without the hesitation she had expected from an injured animal asked to carry a rider. He moved with purpose, the specific directional purpose of an animal that knew where it was going. She let him go. The second day was harder than the first in every measurable way. The water ran out by mid-morning. The food was gone by noon. The heat reached a pitch that she had no word for, a temperature that stopped feeling like heat and started feeling like something personal, something intentional. The desert pressing its argument against her survival with a focused malice that was almost impressive in its thoroughness. She talked to Cinder. She had not done this before. Talking to horses had always seemed to her a slightly eccentric habit. The kind of thing people did when they had run out of better options for companionship. She had better options was the thing. Had them. Emmett had been her better option for 5 years. Now she talked to the horse. She told him about the tomatoes she had wanted to plant in spring. She described in more detail than the project probably warranted exactly where she had planned to put the garden. The south-facing slope below the house, the way the light fell there in the afternoon. The particular quality of the soil in that spot, which she had tested with her fingers and found to be good, genuinely good, dark and rich, and full of promise. Cinder's ears moved as she talked. Not the frantic, alarmed movement of an anxious animal, but the relaxed swiveling of an animal that was listening, actually listening the way a good listener does, with his full attention and without interruption. "He would have helped me dig," she told Cinder. "He wasn't much for gardening as a thing in itself, but he liked being useful and he liked being near me. So he would have helped me dig and complained about his back and then been genuinely proud of the tomatoes when they came in, as if he'd done it himself." Cinder made a low sound, not quite a nicker, something more internal than that, a vibration in his chest that she felt through her legs. "I know," she said. The terrain changed through the afternoon. The flat, featureless scrubland gave way to something more dramatic, the land beginning to fold and buckle low, mesas rising on either side, the soil darkening from pale alkali dust to deeper red, the scattered scrub giving way to occasional stands of juniper that smelled of something green and living. The canyon country. She had known it was out here, had seen its edges from the higher ground around Caldera Creek, but she had never come this far into it. It was beautiful, she noted with the remote part of her mind that was still capable of noting such things. Even now, even dying of thirst in it. It was a landscape that had not been made for human comfort, had not been arranged with human aesthetics in mind, but it had its own austere, enormous beauty, the kind that didn't ask you to enjoy it, that simply existed at a scale too large for approval or disapproval, indifferent and perfect. Cinder moved through it without hesitation. Every fork in the natural pathways between rock formations, every choice between one canyon corridor and another, he navigated with the calm certainty of an animal following a memory, rather than discovering a route. Vera noticed this. She filed it away next to the letter, next to the bottle, next to Emmett's voice in her memory, saying things she was only now too late fully hearing. He's been there. He knows the way. The sun was dropping toward the western rim of the canyon when Cinder stopped. He stopped so suddenly that she nearly pitched forward over his neck. She caught herself on his mane, straightened, and looked at what he was looking at. A wall of rock. Vertical. Solid. A cliff face of dark red sandstone rising perhaps 60 feet unmarked by any gap or passage she could see. The canyon they had been following had simply ended, closed off by this wall as decisively as a door slammed shut. A dead end. She felt the last of something leave her. Not hope, exactly. Hope had been running thin for a while. Something more foundational than hope. The basic structural belief that survival was a reasonable ambition, that effort produced outcomes, that a dying woman following a dying horse through a dead man's promise had some chance of arriving somewhere other than here. Emmett, she said, not to the horse, not to anyone present, just to him, wherever he was. Emmett, I followed him like you said. Cinder moved. He moved toward the wall, not slowing, not hesitating, walking directly at the solid face of the rock, as if he intended to walk through it. Vera grabbed his mane again, certain he had finally broken under the heat, and the exhaustion that she was about to watch him walk into solid stone. And then she saw it. Not a gap, not a passage, a fissure barely, a vertical crack in the cliff face, perhaps 18 inches across at its widest, tapering to nothing at the top, running from ground level up, maybe 15 feet before the rock closed over it. You would not see it unless you were directly in front of it, and even then you would look at it and conclude it was not a passage because no reasonable animal could navigate it. Cinder walked into it sideways, angling his body with a precision that seemed impossible for an animal his size, and disappeared. She heard his hooves on the other side. She heard the change in the sound, the way the acoustics shifted as he moved into a different kind of space, larger, more open, the hoofbeats no longer flat and dusty, but ringing slightly resonant, the sound of a horse moving into an enclosed place with water in it. With water in it. She smelled it before she consciously processed what she was smelling. Damp stone, green things, living air, humid and cool, pouring out of the fissure like a gift being offered through a crack in the world. She dismounted. Her legs nearly buckled when she hit the ground. She had not realized how much of her remaining strength had been spent simply on staying upright in the saddle. She caught herself on the rock wall, steadied, and stood for a moment with her forehead pressed against the cool stone inside the shadow of the fissure. Cool. The rock was actually cool in here. In the shadow, out of the direct assault of the sun, the stone held a different temperature, something it had kept through the long day, preserved in its depth, patient as everything else in this country was patient, but yielding it now, freely giving it to her forehead without reservation. She pushed into the fissure. The rock grabbed at her shoulders, scraped her arms, pressed against her from both sides in a way that should have been frightening and instead felt strange, as this was like something else, like being its arms around her and saying, "Keep going. A little further. You're almost through." She came through the other side and stopped. The canyon opened into a basin circular, perhaps 100 yards across, the walls rising steep and close on every side, forming a natural amphitheater of dark red rock. The failing light of late afternoon fell into it at an angle that turned everything gold and amber, and in that golden light the basin was, she could find no other word for it, alive. A waterfall came down the north face of the canyon wall. Not enormous, perhaps 30 feet of drop, but solid and steady and real, a genuine curtain of moving water, catching the last sunlight and throwing it back as silver and white, striking a pool at the base that was deep and clear in the color of turquoise. The sound of it filled the basin completely, a constant living roar that she felt in her chest, in her back teeth, in the soles of her feet. Around the pool, ferns. Actual ferns, green and ridiculous and improbable, growing in every crack and crevice where the spray reached. Above them, moss-thick, emerald, opulent moss, covering the wet sections of the wall in long vertical sweeps. And along the east side of the basin, in a spot that would receive morning sun, a dense growth of what she recognized, even in her depleted state, as something deliberately cultivated, the ghost of a garden. Gone wild over years of neglect, but still determinedly productive, still sending up the volunteers of old plantings like messages from whoever had put them there. Cinder was already at the pool's edge, drinking. She made it about 15 steps before her knees decided they had done enough, and went down of their own accord. She did not fight them. She let herself go down to the bank of the pool, got her hands into the water, felt the cold of it, genuinely, shockingly cold, go through her palms and up her arms and into the core of her body like a resetting of something that had been running dangerously hot. She brought the water to her face, drank more, stopped herself before she drank too fast, and started again in smaller sips, disciplined. Now that the immediate animal panic of thirst was dimmed enough to let reason back in. The water tasted like stone and minerals and cold and something she had no name for, something clean in a way that made everything she had drunk before seem murky by comparison. It tasted like the inside of the mountain, like water that had been filtering down through layers of rock for centuries before arriving here, arriving now, arriving exactly when she needed it. She laughed. It surprised her, the sound of it, rough and unfamiliar in her throat, half a sob and half something genuinely, absurdly amused. She was sitting beside a hidden waterfall in the middle of the Arizona desert, alive, and the water tasted like a miracle, and her dead husband's horse had led her here through a crack in a cliff wall, and the whole thing was so improbable, so specifically, precisely improbable, that the only reasonable response was apparently to laugh. Cinder lifted his head from the water and looked at her. "I know," she said. She was crying now, she noticed. Both things at once, laughing and crying the way you sometimes do when the pressure of something finally releases and your body doesn't know how to process the release without doing all of it at the same time. "I know. He said you knew the way." Cinder lowered his head and went back to drinking with the practical dignity of an animal who had done what was required of him and was now tending to his own needs, which was, Vera reflected, more or less exactly how Emmett had operated. She sat beside the pool until the light faded from gold to purple, to the deep velvet dark of a desert night full of stars. The waterfall sang its constant note. The ferns moved in the air the falling water created. The basin, which had been a furnace ceiling all day, was now, through some trick of its shape, some retention of cool air from the depths of the surrounding rock, genuinely, mercifully cool. She should explore. She should assess her situation. She should be practical. She looked at the waterfall, silver in the starlight. Emmett had been here, 18 years old and lost, and he had stumbled through that crack in the world and found this place, and it had saved his life, and then he had carried the knowledge of it for 17 years like a secret gift, waiting for the moment when it was truly needed. He had known. Not that he would die, she didn't think he'd known that specifically, but he had known his father, and he had known the world his father operated in, and he had known that a woman alone in that world needed something that couldn't be taken from her by a man with a property deed, something the law couldn't reach, something hidden. He had left her a hiding place. She pressed her hand against her coat, feeling the shape of the folded letter against her sternum. "I left something there for you. You'll know it when you find it." She hadn't found it yet. Not the thing he meant. The water, yes. The basin, yes. But he had said something specific, and she believed him. Tomorrow she would look. Tonight she would sleep. She curled up on the ground beside the pool. Not the ground she would have chosen. Not comfortable in any ordinary sense, the stone beneath the thin layer of soil, hard and uneven. But the cool air moved over her like a blanket, and the sound of the waterfall was the steadiest sound she had ever heard, more constant than breathing, more reliable than heartbeats. The sound of something that had been running for longer than anyone alive, and would keep running long after everyone currently alive was not. Cinder settled nearby. She heard him lower himself carefully, protecting his injured leg, finding a position that accommodated the damage. She heard his breathing slow and deepen. She closed her eyes. In the last moment before sleep took her, she thought, "I followed him, like you said." And she thought that somewhere in whatever territory exists on the other side of the last silence, Emmett Holt was nodding. "Good," he would be saying, in his quiet, reliable, sandstone solid way. "Good. Now rest. Tomorrow you build." She woke to the sound of water and forgot for 3 full seconds everything that had happened. There was just the sound, constant, generous, indifferent to human suffering in the best possible way, and the cool air moving across her face, and the smell of wet stone and living green things. For 3 seconds she was simply a woman waking in a cool place after a long exhaustion, and it was enough. It was more than enough. Then memory returned the way it always does, patient and complete. She lay still and let it settle over her. Emmett, Arden, the house with the bolted door, the bottle in the saddlebag, the letter, the crack in the cliff wall, and the basin on the other side of it, and Cinder drinking with his muzzle submerged to his eyes, while she laughed and cried at the edge of an impossible pool. She opened her eyes. The basin in morning light was a different place than the basin at dusk. The canyon walls channeled the early sun into a single concentrated shaft that struck the waterfall directly, and the waterfall threw it back in every direction. Small spinning fragments of light that moved across the wet stone walls like something alive, like a language being written and immediately erased and written again. The ferns along the walls caught the light and held it in their fronds, and the pool beneath the fall was deep and luminous, the turquoise color even more striking in full morning than it had been in the fading gold of the previous evening. Vera sat up slowly. Her body had opinions about everything: the hardness of the ground, the hours without real food, the accumulated effort of 2 days in the desert. She listened to its opinions without much sympathy and stood anyway. Cinder was awake, standing near the pool's edge. He had moved in the night. She could see where he'd cropped the grass growing along the bank, leaving a neat semicircle of shorter growth. His injured leg, she noticed with careful attention, was bearing slightly more weight than it had the day before. Not healed, not close to healed, but the rest and the water had done something. The inflammation was less visible. The guarding posture was less pronounced. She went to the pool and drank until she felt her body begin to reconstitute itself from the inside out, the specific cellular relief of a body, reclaiming its proper water content after days of deficit. She splashed water on her face and arms, watched the red dust of the desert dissolve off her skin and disperse in the current near the bank. Then she began to look. Emmett had said he left something here. He had been deliberate about that, not "there might be" or "I think I remember." He had said it with the confidence of someone describing something specific, something placed in waiting. She started with the cabin. She had seen it the night before, registered it as a structure at the far end of the basin without processing it fully. Now she looked at it properly. It was more ruin than building at this point. 3 walls of stacked flat stone, the 4th partially collapsed, the roof entirely gone. The stones had been chosen and laid with care, she could see that. Each one fitted against its neighbors with the patience of someone who understood that a wall built right the first time didn't need to be rebuilt. Decades of weather had shifted some of them, and the missing roof had allowed moisture and vegetation to work on the mortar, but the basic structure was sound. Someone had built to last. She stepped inside. The floor was packed earth, compacted by years of foot traffic, and then by years of neglect into something approaching stone in its density. A fire pit sat in the center, a ring of blackened rocks, the ashes within them aged past any memory of warmth. She crouched beside it and ran her fingers along the fire-darkened surface of the stones. Someone had cooked here, had sat beside these stones in the evening exactly as she had sat beside the pool the previous night, listening to the waterfall's constant note. Who? She stood and moved to the back wall, the wall that was still fully intact, using the natural cliff face as its foundation. At the base of the wall, half buried under a drift of old leaves and fallen stone dust, she found the corner of something wooden. She knelt and began to clear it with her hands. It took 20 minutes of careful digging. The soil was damp and pact-resistant, releasing the object slowly as if reconsidering. What emerged finally was a wooden box, roughly made. The wood darkened with age and moisture, but structurally intact, sealed with a simple iron latch that had rusted but not corroded through. She sat back on her heels and looked at it. Then she opened it. Inside, nested in a bed of dried grass that had once been arranged with care and was now simply compressed with age, she found 3 things. A small hand trowel, iron-headed, its wooden handle rotted to a stub, but the blade still usable. A cloth pouch tightly sealed with a drawstring of leather cord, dry and stiff with age. And a book. Not a large book. A small one, perhaps 5 inches by 7, bound in leather that had dried and cracked, but held together, tied shut, with a length of cord wrapped multiple times around the covers. She picked it up. It was heavier than its size suggested. She untied the cord with careful fingers, the old leather of it crumbling slightly at the knot. The cover had no title. She opened it. The first page bore handwriting, fine, careful handwriting, the kind that took effort and meant the writer understood that effort applied to words was a form of respect. This book belongs to Harriet Voss, begun in the year of 1856 in the basin. I have decided to call Mercy Springs in the canyon country of the Arizona Territory. I am writing it so that what I have learned here does not die with me. Vera turned the page. She sat on the earthen floor of the ruined cabin and read. Harriet Voss had been a widow from Illinois. Her husband, a man named George, had died of a fever in 1854, leaving her with nothing but debt and the quiet contempt of a community that had decided her misfortune was a judgment rather than an accident. She had come west, she wrote, because the alternative was to stay in a place that had already decided what she was, and she found that intolerable. She had traveled with a small wagon train as far as Tucson, then made a series of increasingly questionable decisions that had resulted in her being alone in the canyon country in the summer of 1856, with a failing mule and no clear plan. The mule, she wrote, had found the basin. Vera paused at that. The mule had found the basin, had stopped at the fissure in the cliff wall, and refused to move in any direction except through it. and Harriet, who had been traveling with this animal long enough to develop a working respect for its judgment, had followed. She read on. Harriet had stayed for 6 years, not because she was trapped. The way out was the same crack in the wall that had brought her in, and she had used it regularly to forage in the surrounding canyon country for things the basin didn't provide. She stayed because the basin sustained her, and because she had chosen to treat the sustaining of herself as a project worthy of full commitment. She had rebuilt the cabin. She had planted the garden, the corn and beans and squash that she wrote about in careful practical detail, their planting distances and water requirements, and the specific properties of the basin's soil that made them thrive. She had observed the waterfall's patterns through seasons, noted the way the basin's temperature moderated even the worst of the Arizona summers, cataloged the plants that grew along the pool's edge and their various uses. She had been a scientist of survival, Harriet Voss, a thorough and patient one. And then in the spring of 1862, she had packed what she could carry and walked out. The last entry was the one Vera read 3 times. I am leaving because I have taken what I needed from this place, and it was given freely, and the only honest response to a gift freely given is to pass it forward. This basin did not save me so that I could possess it. It saved me so that I could learn what I needed to learn and carry that learning back into the world and use it. I have left the seeds. I have left the tools. I have rebuilt the cabin as best I can. If you are reading this, you are the one who needed to find it next. Take what you need, leave it better than you found it, and when you are ready, not before, but when you are ready, do what I am doing now. Trust the land, trust your hands, trust whatever creature led you here because it knew something you didn't. H.V. April 1862, Vera closed the book. She sat in the ruined cabin for a long time with the book in her lap, and the morning light shifting through the open roof above her, and she thought about the chain of it. Harriet Voss in 1856, arriving desperate behind a stubborn mule. Harriet staying and building and learning and leaving. And then the basin sitting empty, waiting, patient, as stone patient, as water patient, as anything that has no reason to hurry until 1874, until a lost 18-year-old boy had found his way through the fissure. She opened the book again and turned to the last pages. After Harriet's final entry, there were blank pages, 12 of them yellowed with age, and then on the 13th blank page, from the back in a different hand, entirely compressed forward, leaning the specific way of making letters that she would have known among 10,000 others, Emmett. July 1874. I don't know who left this book or these seeds or the work that went into this place, but I owe them my life. I've been here 3 days. I came in half dead and I'm leaving whole. I didn't touch the seeds, felt wrong to take them when I didn't know what they were for. I fixed the section of wall that had come down on the east side. It was the least I could do. I don't know if anyone will ever read this, but if you're here, you needed to be here. The woman who wrote these pages understood something. I'm only beginning to understand that some things in this world exist outside the logic of ownership. This place doesn't belong to anyone. It belongs to whoever needs it. If you came here the way I did, lost and desperate and not sure you were going to make it, you made it. You're here. That's enough for now. H. And then in smaller letters below, clearly added at a different moment, perhaps just before he left, I hope someday someone I love finds this. I hope they know I left it for them. Vera pressed the book against her chest and held it there. He had written that in 7 years before he met her. He had written it for a hypothetical person, a future person, someone he hadn't encountered yet, and then he had met her and married her and carried the secret of this place for 12 years of their life together, waiting perhaps, hoping that the waiting would prove unnecessary, that Arden would soften or the world would shift, that she would never need what he had prepared. And when he lay dying and understood that the waiting was over and the preparation was needed, he had written the letter and left it in the saddlebag with the only horse he absolutely trusted. He had been planning for her survival since before he knew her name. She let herself cry. Properly this time, not the half-laughing release of the previous evening, but the full, unguarded grief of a woman alone in the wilderness with a dead man's handwriting pressed against her heart. She cried for a long time. Cinder came and stood in the doorway of the cabin and watched her with his dark, serious eyes. And she was grateful for the witnessing, for the quiet animal presence of it, for the fact that her grief had a witness, even if the witness was a horse. When she was done, she wiped her face with the back of her hand, set the book carefully on the driest section of the floor, and stood up. She opened the cloth pouch. Seeds. Dozens of them, sorted and separated by type within the pouch, divided by small folds of inner cloth. Corn, full and pale. Beans mottled and smooth, squash wide and flat, all of them decades old, all of them perhaps against any reasonable expectation intact, protected by the dryness of the sealed pouch, preserved in the cool dark of the buried box waiting. She held one corn kernel in her palm, turned it in the light coming through the ruined roof. If she planted these and they grew, she would eat. If they grew well, she would have enough to preserve for winter. If she could keep herself alive through one winter, one full cycle of the seasons, she would be beyond the reach of the immediate crisis into something that might be called a life, rather than simply a survival. It was a great many ifs. She closed her fingers around the kernel and went to look at the garden. The ground along the east wall of the basin was extraordinary. She had registered this the night before without fully understanding it, and now she got down on her knees and pressed her hands into it and understood it completely. Years of waterfall mist and composting vegetation had built the soil into something dark and deep and alive. You could feel the life in it, the microbial density of earth that had been building its resources for a long time without interference. It was the best soil she had ever touched. Better than the kitchen garden behind the house in Caldera Creek, better than the bottomland fields she'd grown up on in her parents' small farm in New Mexico. It was as if the basin had been preparing the ground. She spent the rest of the morning working. She had no proper tools beyond the iron trowel head whose rotted handle she replaced with a branch cut from one of the small juniper trees growing along the basin's south wall. Lashed in place with strips of leather she cut from her boot tops. It was crude and imperfect and worked well enough. She turned the soil along the east wall, working from the canyon wall inward, breaking up the surface crust and turning up the rich dark earth beneath. Clearing the wild volunteer plants that had colonized Harriet's old garden beds, some of them, the descendants of Harriet's own plantings gone wild over decades, the genetic memory of cultivation persisting in their form even as they'd reverted to wilderness. Her hands, she noted, were not accustomed to this. She had kept a kitchen garden in Caldera Creek, had spent time in the soil regularly enough. But this was different work, sustained, heavy, requiring the full engagement of muscles in her shoulders and back that were already taxed from 2 days of desert travel. By midday, her palms were raw and her back was a single long complaint. She kept working. There was something in the working that she had not expected, a quality of presence, of engagement with the immediate physical world that functioned as an antidote to the kind of thinking that would if she let it pull her under. When her hands were in the soil, when her attention was on the resistance of the earth and the correct depth for planting, and the distance between rows, there was no room for the image of Arden's face across that table, for the memory of Corbett's eyes fixed on the floor, for the specific quality of loss that sat in her chest where her life with Emmett used to be. The garden would not allow it. She planted in the late afternoon when the direct sun had shifted off the east wall, and the soil was in shadow, better for the seeds, she knew, less shock to the planting. She worked methodically, following Harriet's instructions in the journal with the same respect she would have given a mentor present in the room. Corn in the center, planted in clusters to allow cross-pollination. Beans alongside to climb the corn stalks as they grew. Squash at the outer edges, their broad leaves to spread across the soil and hold the moisture in. The three sisters. She had heard the term somewhere, an old way of thinking about these three plants, a recognition that they supported each other in ways that made each one stronger than it would have been alone. She thought about that as she pressed each seed into the dark earth, the way some things could not thrive in isolation, the way interdependence in the right configuration was not weakness, but design. She pressed her palm flat against the planted soil when she was done. "Grow," she said, the same word she supposed that Harriet had said 60 years earlier, the same word every person who had ever put a seed in the ground had said, in every language, in every era, a prayer and an instruction simultaneously. She repaired the cabin over the following days with the focused intensity of someone who understood that shelter was not a comfort but a requirement. The collapsed east wall she rebuilt stone by stone, selecting each rock from the rubble with the patience of someone doing a puzzle, fitting shapes together, compensating for irregularity with the clay she found in heavy deposits near the pool's edge, mixing it with dried grass to create a mortar that surprised her with its effectiveness. The work taught her things about herself. She had not known particularly that she could do this. She had been a farmer's daughter and then a rancher's wife, had done physical work all her life. But there was a difference between the physical work of maintaining an existing structure and the physical work of creating one. And the difference lived in the mind as much as the body. Building required decisions, dozens of small ones every hour. Each choice about which stone went where, foreclosing other choices, each decision about the line of the wall, committing her to everything that followed it. She could not borrow the confidence of an established structure. She had to generate it. She found she could. Cinder watched her work with the alert attention of an animal with no other occupation. His leg improved steadily by the 5th day. He was bearing full weight on it, favoring it slightly but no longer guarding it. The gash on his flank, which she cleaned each morning with water from the pool and dressed with a poultice she made from the abundant plantain growing along the bank, was closing cleanly. His coat, free of dust for the first time in the days she'd known him in this state, was coming back to something approaching its proper depth of black. I was, she thought, a genuinely beautiful animal. She told him so one evening, sitting outside the repaired cabin, watching the last light leave the top of the waterfall. He received the information with the composed dignity of an animal that had always known this and was glad she'd finally caught up. "Emmett used to tell you, didn't he?" she said. One ear swiveled toward her. "He told you every day, I'd guess. He was like that. He noticed things and said them out loud. He thought it was important to say things out loud." She had not always understood this about him while he was alive. She understood it now with a clarity that was almost physical. The way his habit of naming good things aloud had functioned as an anchor, had kept the days from blurring into shapelessness, had insisted on the specific reality of each moment by marking it with language. She had taken it for granted, the way you take for granted anything that holds you steady until it stops. The roof was the hardest part. She harvested the tall reeds growing where the pool's overflow trickled away through the rocks at the basin's southern edge, tough, fibrous, flexible, and spent 3 full days weaving them into mats, dense enough to shed rain, laying them over a framework of branches cut from the basin's junipers. The first version let in light. She wove a second layer tighter, better. Not perfect, but sufficient, which was the standard she had decided to apply to everything she built here. Not perfect, but sufficient. Perfect was an enemy of done and done, was what kept you alive. On the night, She finished the roof. She built a fire in the ancient fire pit, ate the last of the dried berries she'd found growing along the south wall, and opened Harriet's journal to a blank page. She had been carrying the journal with her since she found it tucked inside her coat. She had reread Harriet's entries and Emmett's single page so many times she could recite them. Now she found a pencil stub in the inner pocket of her coat. She had entirely forgotten it was there. The specific amnesia of crisis. The way your mind sheds information it can't currently use. And she sat beside the fire and wrote, October 1886. I have been here 22 days. The cabin has a roof. The garden is in the ground. Cinder is healing. I am something I don't have a word for yet. Not well, not recovered, but no longer purely broken, which may be the same thing at this stage. I found your notes, Harriet, and his. I want you both to know that what you left here was received. It was received and it mattered, and I am trying to be worthy of it. She stopped, stared at the fire for a while, then wrote, I don't know what comes next. I know what I'm doing tomorrow, more clay for the gap in the north wall, and I want to check the squash seeds I planted near the east corner because the soil there seems wetter than the rest, and I'm worried about rot. The day after that I can see clearly enough. Past that I can't see at all. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's actually enough. She closed the journal. The fire crackled. The waterfall sang. She thought she heard something. She sat very still, the way you go still when you hear something unfamiliar in a world that has become very familiar, when your body knows before your mind does that the sound is new. Cinder's head came up. His ears went forward, both of them locked and pointing, the posture of absolute attention. He was looking at the fissure in the cliff wall, the narrow crack that was the only entrance to the basin. Vera stood. She heard it again. Not an animal sound. She had learned the basin's animals over 3 weeks, their sounds and schedules, the way the canyon wrens sang at dusk and the small creatures rustled in the ferns at night. This was not any of those. It was a child's voice. Or not a voice exactly, something between a sound and a word, the incomplete vocalization of someone who had been trying to call out for help and no longer had the strength to complete it. She was already moving. She reached the fissure and pushed through it into the outer darkness of the canyon. The night was clear and hard with stars, the canyon walls dark masses against the lighter dark of the sky. At the base of the cliff, small and crumpled against the rock like something dropped from a height, was a child. A girl, small, perhaps 7 or 8 years old. Though it was hard to assess age in this state, the body contracted by dehydration and fear into something that seemed younger than it was. Her clothing was in tatters, desert-reddened, dust-covered. Her face, when Vera knelt beside her and turned it toward the starlight, was a mask of the same white dust that had coated Vera's own face 2 weeks ago, the specific pallor of the desert's claim on a body. She had a pulse. Vera's fingers found it in her neck, rapid, shallow, the frantic beating of a heart working very hard to maintain a system running on fumes. Vera gathered her up. The child weighed almost nothing. That was the most frightening thing, that a child's body could be reduced to this weight, this fragile lightness, in however many days it had taken her to get here. Vera carried her through the fissure, through the crack in the world, into the basin, into the cool air, and the sound of water, and the steady silver light of the waterfall in the dark. She laid the girl at the pool's edge and dipped a strip torn from her own shirt in the water, and began, as someone had once done for her, to moisten those cracked and bloodless lips, squeezing drops, waiting, squeezing more. The girl's eyes opened. They were large eyes, darker in this light than she could accurately assess, but large and serious in the way of children who have seen things they weren't supposed to see yet. They fixed on Vera's face with the stunned incomprehension of someone waking in a place entirely different from where they lost consciousness. Then they found the waterfall. And the child made a sound that Vera felt in her chest, a sound of pure involuntary wonder, the sound of a body recognizing salvation before the mind has processed it. Vera let her drink in small sips, controlling the pace, watching the girl's color begin its slow return from the gray edge of crisis towards something warmer. She had been trained in nothing medical. Everything she did she was doing from instinct and observation, from the memory of the 2 days that had reduced her to the same condition, from the simple logic of knowing what she had needed. "What's your name?" she asked when the girl had drunk enough to be capable of language. A pause, a swallow, then Ren. Vera went still. She looked at the child more carefully, the large, serious eyes, the particular set of the jaw. She knew that jaw. She had sat across a table from it for 5 years. "Ren Holt," she said, not a question. The child looked at her with those serious eyes and nodded once. Corbett's daughter, Emmett's niece, the little girl who had touched her hand the last morning in the house in Caldera Creek, with the gentle instinct of a child who understands fragility without being told to. Vera sat back on her heels and looked at the waterfall, and thought about what it meant that this particular child had come through that particular crack in the cliff on this particular night. She thought about Harriet's last journal entry, about chains and passages and things that existed to be given, not kept. She thought about Emmett writing, "I hope someday someone I love finds this." Then she looked back at Ren, her niece, in the way that mattered, the way that 5 years of family makes, and saw the girl's eyes beginning to droop with the specific exhausted relief of a body that had been running on crisis and had now finally been given permission to stop. "You're safe," Vera told her, simple words, the right ones. "You're safe. The water is real. You're going to be all right." She settled the child against her side, one arm around her, and felt Ren's weight give itself over completely, the full, trustful collapse of a child who believed what an adult had told her. From somewhere beyond the fissure in the outer darkness of the canyon, she heard another sound. Voices. Adult voices. Calling a name. Calling Ren. Vera closed her eyes for just a moment. She knew those voices too. She knew what it meant that they were here. She knew what was coming through that crack in the world next, and what it would require of her, and how hard it was going to be, and how she was going to do it anyway. She pressed her lips briefly against the top of Ren's dusty head. Then she raised her voice and called out into the dark canyon. "She's here. She's safe. Come through the wall." The first one through the fissure was Selma. She came through sideways the way Vera had come through weeks ago, scraping her shoulders against the rock, and she emerged into the basin's cool air with the stumbling urgency of a woman who had been running on the specific fuel of a mother's panic, that particular grade of desperation that burns cleaner and hotter than anything else a human body can generate. She saw Ren first. She crossed the distance between them in 4 steps and went down to her knees and gathered the child against her chest and made a sound that had no language in it, no words, nothing that could be transcribed or reported, only the raw animal relief of a mother who had been looking at the worst possible outcome and been told at the last possible moment that it wasn't going to happen. Vera stood back and watched and did not intrude on it. Corbett came through second. I was taller than she remembered, or perhaps the memory had compressed him. Grief had a way of shrinking people in retrospect, collapsing them toward whatever was most essential about them. And what was most essential about Corbett Holt, in Vera's memory, was the image of him staring at the floor of that front room, while his father delivered a verdict that he had the size and the standing to contest, and chose not to. In memory, he had become small. In person, he was still a large man, broad through the shoulders, with Emmett's coloring and Arden's jaw, and a quality of physical presence that had never translated into the moral authority it suggested. He stood in the basin and looked at his wife and daughter, and then he looked at the waterfall, and then, with the careful slowness of a man who has been avoiding something and understands that the avoiding is over, he looked at Vera. The last time she had seen his face, it had been turned away from her. She held his gaze now and waited. He opened his mouth. She could see him building towards something, an explanation, a justification, the defensive architecture that people construct between themselves and their own worst decisions. She watched him build it and watched him in the same motion understand that it was the wrong structure for this moment, that nothing built from justification was going to hold up in this particular place. With the waterfall behind her and his daughter alive in his wife's arms because of a woman he had watched being cast out without a word of objection, he let it go. The whole construction just released it. What was left on his face when the defensiveness fell away was simpler and worse and more honest. It was shame undisguised and full, the expression of a man who has finally stopped negotiating with what he knows about himself. Vera, he said, just her name, no architecture around it. Corbett, she said. A beat of silence between them, the waterfall filling it indifferent and constant. "Come inside," she said. "There's water, and food not much, but enough for tonight." She turned and walked to the cabin without waiting to see if he followed. He did. They both did. Selma carrying Wren Corbett a step behind, entering the space Vera had built with her hands over the past weeks, with the careful, subdued awareness of people who understood they were walking into something they had not earned and were being given anyway. She fed them from her stores, dried beans she had been rationing, the last of the wild berries, water from the pool in the clay cup she had shaped and fired over the fire pit. Wren drank 2 full cups without pausing and fell asleep against Selma's side before she'd finished the 3rd. Selma ate with the focused efficiency of a woman fueling a body that had been running empty, not tasting, just taking in what was needed. Corbett ate slowly, mechanically, his eyes moving around the cabin, the repaired walls, the woven roof, the journal sitting on the stone shelf Vera had built against the back wall. "You built this," he said, not a question. "Most of it was already here. I rebuilt it." "How long have you been here?" 23 days. He was quiet for a moment. "We've been walking for 4 days. The well in Caldera Creek went dry 5 weeks ago. People started leaving, some north toward Flagstaff, some just..." He stopped. "The cattle are gone. Everything the drought didn't take, people sold for water. There's almost no one left." Vera listened to this without expression. She noted what it did inside her, the complex layering of it, the grief for the place she had lived for 5 years, sitting underneath the anger at the people who had driven her out of it, sitting underneath something else entirely, something she was not yet ready to name. "Your father," she said. Corbett's jaw tightened. "He's alive. He stayed. He said..." A pause. "He said he wasn't going to leave the house." "Silas." Something shifted in Corbett's face at the name relief she thought that she had asked about him. "He was alive when we left. He said he'd follow in a day or 2. He said there was something he needed to do first." Vera nodded. She banked the fire and told them where to sleep and went outside and sat beside the pool in the dark for a long time, listening to the waterfall and thinking about what came next. What came next arrived over the following week, in the way that difficult things often arrive, not all at once, which would have been manageable, but in increments, each one requiring a separate adjustment, a separate decision about what she was going to be in the face of it. 3 more families found the basin over the next 4 days. She did not know how they found it, some combination of Corbett and Selma telling others before they left of the faint, cool draft, that seemed to flow from the canyon's rock formations on the hottest days of the desperate calculus of people who had exhausted every other option and were following whatever fragment of possibility remained. They arrived in the same state Vera had arrived in, depleted, dust-covered.
The proud and ordinary faces of people she had known in a functioning community now wearing the stripped-down expression of people who had been reduced to the essential. She let them all in. She did not make speeches about it. She did not enumerate what it cost her, what it meant, what she was choosing, and what she was setting aside in order to make the choice. She simply stood at the basin entrance and said, "Come in," and pointed them toward the water and the food she had, and assessed what they were capable of and put them to work. Because there was work, an enormous amount of it suddenly, with 12 people in a space designed for one. She established the rules on the second day, standing in the center of the basin with the waterfall behind her, and all of them gathered in a rough semicircle, watching her with the attentive wariness of people who understand they are dependent and are not entirely comfortable with that understanding.
"The water is free," she said. "Drink what you need. Don't waste it." She looked at each face as she spoke, the Darby family, the older couple whose name she was still learning, the young man who had come alone and hadn't spoken since he arrived. "The food we have goes to the children and anyone too sick to work first. Everyone else eats after they've contributed to the day's work." She paused. "This isn't a punishment. This is how things stay balanced."
The basin has enough for all of us if we treat it right. It won't have enough if we treat it like it owes us something. She saw some faces tighten at this. People who had been in their previous lives accustomed to a different relationship with the concept of earning. She understood it. She had lived that life too, the life where your standing was given, where the question of whether you deserved what you had was not a question that came up very often. The desert had cured her of that. "The garden needs expanding," she continued. "I'll show you where and how. The cabin needs a second structure built against the south wall. We need shelter for everyone before the temperature drops. The pool's overflow channel is partially blocked on the east side and needs clearing." She paused again. "If you have skills, tell me. If you don't know what you're capable of, we'll find out together." She put Corbett on construction. He was strong and had some experience with stonework from the ranch, and the labor suited him. It was the kind of work that absorbed a man who needed to be absorbed, that asked for the full physical commitment, that left no energy for the circular thinking of guilt. She watched him work over those early days with the focused overperformance of someone paying a debt, hauling stones that were too heavy, working past the point of ordinary fatigue. And she let him do it without comment. The second shelter grew fast under his hands, faster than she had built the cabin, because he worked as if the building itself was an argument he was making to someone he couldn't face directly. She understood that too. Selma had a knowledge of plants that proved immediately useful. She had grown up on a farm in Nebraska, had preserved and stored food through hard winters, and she took over the identification and preparation of the basin's wild foods with a competent efficiency that freed Vera to focus on the expanding garden. They worked alongside each other for hours without speaking, and then spoke when they needed to. And the silence between them was not uncomfortable but functional. The silence of two women who have decided that what needs to be done is more urgent than the processing of everything that sits between them. On the 5th day, Silas came through the fissure. He was 61 years old and had the build of a man who had spent 4 decades at a forge, wide through the chest and shoulders, with large calloused hands, and a face that the desert had been working on for years before this particular drought made its final argument. He had walked from Caldera Creek alone, he said. 4 days. He had brought nothing except the knowledge Vera had known he was carrying since Corbett mentioned his name. He sat beside the pool and drank for a long time before he spoke. "Arden knows where you are," he said. Vera was weeding the expanded garden plot.
She did not stop weeding. How? Corbett told him. Before you ask, the boy didn't mean harm by it. He thought his father ought to know you were alive. I think he thought it might. Silas paused, choosing words with the care of an old man who had learned that imprecision costs. I think he thought it might do something for the old man to know.
And did it? A long pause. The waterfall filling it. He stopped eating about 3 weeks after you left, Silas said.
Wouldn't say it was about you, said it was the heat, said it was the loss of the cattle, said it was one thing after another. But I've known Arden Holt for 30 years. I know what grief looks like when it's wearing a different coat. He paused again. He lost Emmett. Then he lost the last piece of Emmett he had left, because what he did to you was the last thing he did as Emmett's father.
And I think somewhere under all that stone and pride he knows it. Vera's hands stilled in the soil.
He's coming, Silas said. I couldn't tell you exactly when. He needed time to get ready. A man like Arden doesn't walk towards something like this quickly, but he's coming.
Vera sat back on her heels and looked at the garden, the rows she had planted from Harriet's seeds and Emmett's inheritance, the green shoots of corn already showing above the soil, the bean plants beginning their first tentative reach toward the stalks that would support them.
She looked at the waterfall. She looked at Cinder, grazing along the pool's bank, his black coat sleek in the morning light, the silver scar on his leg catching the sun. She thought about what it would mean when Arden Holt came through that fissure, what she would owe him, what she would not owe him, where the line was between generosity and the erasure of her own experience, between forgiveness and the performance of forgiveness, between letting go and pretending nothing had happened. She thought about these things for a long time. Then she went back to weeding. He came on the 8th day after Silas.
She knew it was him before she saw him, Cinder told her.
The horse was grazing near the pool when his head came up with the specific alert attention that Vera had come to read with accuracy over weeks of close observation. Not the alarm posture he used for unfamiliar sounds. Something else, a recognition, a complex and layered response that went through his entire body. His ears forward, his nostrils working, his weight shifting in the particular way of an animal encountering something it has a history with.
She set down the clay vessel she had been carrying and turned toward the fissure.
Arden Holt came through it alone. She had prepared herself, she thought, for the version of Arden. She remembered the large, iron-certain presence of him, the quality he'd had of occupying more space than his physical dimensions required, the way his authority had been a kind of weather system that everyone around him moved within, whether they chose to or not.
The man who emerged from the fissure was not that man.
I was still tall. The frame was still there, the structure of him. But something essential had vacated it, the way a house looks different when the people inside it leave the walls the same, the roof intact. But the quality of it changed entirely. He was thinner, the planes of his face sharpened past the distinction between lean and gaunt. He moved with the careful deliberateness of a man who has been conserving what he has left and is not certain what the final accounting will show.
He had no horse.
He had walked from Caldera Creek however many miles of desert alone at 64 in the killing heat of an Arizona summer. In his right hand he held by the brim a hat.
Emmett's hat.
She recognized it, the specific curve of the crown, the worn leather band, the way the felt had been shaped by years of Emmett's particular way of pushing it back on his head when he was thinking. Arden was holding it
with both hands, now turning it by the brim in the slow rotation of a man who needs something to do with his hands.
The basin had gone quiet behind her. She was aware, without turning to look, that the work had stopped, that Corbett and Selma Silas, the families, all of them, had gone still watching.
Arden's eyes moved across the basin, the waterfall, the garden with its green rose, the repaired cabin, the new shelter going up against the south wall, the people.
He looked at all of it with the slow, thorough attention of a man cataloging a reality he had not been prepared for, and she could see the moment when the full scale of what she had built here resolved into meaning for him. Not just a woman surviving, but a woman building, leading,
creating something from the absolute nothing she had been given. He looked at Cinder last. The horse had not moved. He stood 15 feet from Arden, his attention fully fixed on the old man, his posture at the specific intersection of recognition and wariness, the posture of an animal with Complex feelings about what it is looking at. Arden looked at Cinder for a long time. Then he looked at Vera.
"I don't expect anything from you," he said. His voice was different, still recognizable, but the carrying authority had gone out of it, leaving something smaller and more exposed beneath. "I want you to know that first. I'm not here to ask for anything I haven't earned. I know I haven't earned anything." Vera waited.
"I've been trying to think of the right thing to say since before I left Caldera Creek." He paused.
"I couldn't find it. I've been looking for 30 years for the right way to say things I should have said, and I'm not." His voice broke briefly, a structural failure in something she had always thought was load-bearing. He steadied it. "I'm not a man who's had much practice with being wrong." "I know," Vera said.
"What I did to you was—"
He stopped, started again. "What I told myself was that the land needed to stay with blood. That was the story I used. But Emmett knew what I was doing, I think. He saw through his father better than his father deserved." He looked down at the hat in his hands. "He didn't argue with me about you. He was kind to you in front of me deliberately every chance he got, showing me what you were, showing me what I was failing to see." He paused.
"I chose not to see it." The basin was completely silent behind Vera. Even the children had gone still.
"He loved you," Vera said. "Emmett loved you. I want you to know I believe that." Something crossed Arden's face, a movement too quick and too deep to name, something that came up from somewhere well below the surface of the composed, managed expression he had maintained through this entire impossible conversation. "Did he tell you that?" Arden asked.
"He didn't have to," Vera said.
"He talked about you the way people talk about things they love that are difficult, with patience, with a kind of long patience that you only have for something that matters to you." Arden looked. His jaw worked. "I want to ask you one thing," Vera said, "and I want you to actually answer it, not give me the answer that seems like the right thing to say." He looked back at her. "Did Emmett know you loved him?"
The silence that followed was the longest silence Vera had experienced in the basin, longer than the silences of the early solitary nights, longer than the quiet after she'd planted the seeds and waited. It was the silence of a man looking directly at the most painful, true thing about himself, and finding he has no adequate response because the response he should have given was not given at the time it was needed and cannot be given now. Arden's eyes filled. He did not look away. Whatever he was, whatever he had done, he did not look away from this.
"I don't know," he said. "It came out stripped of everything except its truth. I thought he did. I assumed he did. I never said it the way it needed to be said, and now I can't know if he knew or if he just hoped." Vera held his gaze. "He knew," she said.
She said it, not because it was certainly true, because she could not be certain, but because it was the truest thing she could offer a grieving father who had walked alone through the desert with his dead son's hat in his hands, and because she believed Emmett would have wanted it said. And because there are moments when the most honest thing you can do is give someone the thing they need to survive, even if you cannot prove it. Arden's composure went, not dramatically, not in the way of scenes and gestures. It went quietly in the way of something that has been holding for a very long time and finally understands it, no longer has to. He pressed his hand over his eyes. His shoulders moved once.
Then Cinder walked toward him.
The horse moved without hurry, without drama, with the deliberate and purposeful quality of an animal that has made a decision and is executing it. Vera watched him come the smooth, recovered gait, the scar on his leg silver in the afternoon light, and she did not call him back or redirect him. She waited. Cinder stopped directly in front of Ardenholt, the man who had given this horse a slow poison, the man who had expected him to die in the desert so that the woman riding him would die too tidily and without testimony. Arden stood very still. Cinder extended his head slowly, slowly, the way horses move when they are choosing to be gentle, and placed it against Arden's shoulder. The weight of it, the warm, living, impossible weight of Emmett's horse resting against the shoulder of the man who had wronged him, present and without accusation. Arden put his hand on Cinder's neck. Vera looked away up at the waterfall because some moments are too interior for witnessing, and this was one of them. She looked at the water coming down from the high ledge, constant and cold and ancient, falling the same way it had been falling since before any of them were born, and would continue falling after all of them were gone. And she felt something in her chest that she had not felt in a very long time. Something that was not happiness, not relief, not the grim satisfaction of having survived. Something quieter than any of those. Something she recognized after a moment as the specific peace that comes when a thing has found its right ending. The work of the following weeks was the most demanding of her life, and also the most alive she had felt since before Emmett's illness had changed the quality of everything. She organized the expanded community with the same practical clarity she had brought to organizing herself. The rules did not change for the addition of people. They became more necessary, more articulated, more carefully explained. Water for everyone freely. Food distributed by need first, by contribution second, by former social standing not at all. Work assigned by ability. Decisions about the community made by Vera in consultation with Silas, whose 61 years in forge-hardened common sense she found invaluable, and Selma, whose organizational intelligence she had underestimated until she watched it applied to the problem of feeding 16 people from a desert garden. She had not expected to be a leader. She had not positioned herself as one, had made no speech establishing authority, had claimed no title. But leadership, she was learning, was less a position than a practice, the practice of seeing what needed doing, and doing it, of seeing who needed directing and directing them, of seeing where conflict was building and addressing it before it became crisis. She had been doing these things since before she had a word for them. Since the first days in the basin, when survival had required the same quality of attention and initiative that leading a community required now. The garden expanded twice more. She put every able-bodied person in the community on the work of breaking new ground, extending the cultivated area along the east wall, and then into a previously unexplored section of the basin near the south face, where the soil she discovered was equally good, a different composition, drier but rich in minerals suited to different crops than the north beds. She sent Silas and 2 of the stronger men to search the canyon country outside the basin for additional food sources, and they came back with information about a second spring 2 miles east, unreachable in the drought's worst months, but viable now as conditions shifted, and about several wild stands of plants she had not catalogued. The knowledge compounded. Each person who arrived brought something she did not have: a skill, an observation, a piece of information about the surrounding terrain. She added it all to the working account of what the community knew, maintaining it in her head the way she maintained the garden's planting schedule, carefully and with attention to how each part related to every other part. Corbett built. He built with a sustained intensity that gradually shifted from the overperformance of guilt into something quieter and more honest. The satisfaction of a man doing work
work he was genuinely capable of and doing it well. The second shelter became a third. A proper storage structure went up against the north wall, roofed in the same dense reed matting she had developed for the cabin.
He added a drainage channel around the cabin's foundation that she had not thought of,
and that would prove in the rainy season to have been essential. He did not talk much. He did not apologize directly, not in words, but she understood what he was saying with his hands and his hours, and she accepted it in the same currency it was offered.
Arden did what he could. His physical capacity was limited by the state he had arrived in, depleted with weeks of inadequate nutrition behind him, and she did not assign him heavy work. She assigned him Ren. Not as a punishment and not as a reward. Simply because Ren needed watching during the hours when her parents were working, and Arden needed something to be responsible for that he could not fail at through absence or distraction. A child is too immediate, too demanding of the present moment to allow the kind of retreat into self-recrimination that can consume a man who has done damage and doesn't know what to do with the knowledge of it. She watched from a distance as Arden and Ren found each other. It did not happen quickly or simply.
Ren was a child who paid attention and had inherited enough of the Holt family's perception to be aware that the old man her grandfather had become was not the same figure who had occupied that role before.
But children have a capacity for present tense engagement that adults lose, and what Ren engaged with was not the history of Arden Holt, but the Arden who sat beside her now, who told her the names of the stars in the strip of visible sky above the basin, who helped her carry water in the small clay vessel Vera had made for her, who watched with genuine absorption when she showed him the corn plants she had adopted as her particular responsibility, and reported their progress with the serious authority of someone in charge of something important. One evening she heard Arden laugh, a genuine laugh surprised out of him by something Ren had said, something she hadn't caught. She noted it and said nothing, and went back to the journal entry she was writing in the new pages she had added to Harriet's book, which she had been expanding steadily, recording the community's practices and knowledge with the same thoroughness Harriet had applied to her solitary survival. She wanted whoever came next to have more to work with than she'd had. On a morning in late November, she woke to a smell. She lay still for a moment, cataloging it. Something in the air was different, a quality that didn't belong to the basin's usual atmosphere of waterfall mist and juniper and warm stone. Something from outside, something that the basin's contained microclimate had been keeping out and was now admitting. She sat up. The smell was rain. Not rain itself, not yet.
The precursor of it. The specific mineral sharpness of water evaporating from hot stone miles away, the leading edge of a system moving in from the west. Petrichor, the old word for it, the smell of rain on earth. She had not smelled it in months. She had not smelled it since before Emmett's illness, since the previous spring, when the last decent rain had fallen on Caldera Creek and made everyone believe the drought would break before it really began.
She got up and went outside.
The sky above the basin was different. The hard, polished blue that had dominated for months was acquiring a different quality, a depth, a complexity, the beginning of clouds, building over the western canyon rim.
Real clouds, not the thin, high streaks of cirrus that occasionally crossed in the heat. These were tall and dark-bellied, the blue-gray of serious weather. Cinder was already awake, standing at the pool's edge, his head up, his nostrils working.
"I know," Vera said. She stood beside him, and they both looked at the clouds building above the canyon wall. She could feel the change in pressure in the base of her skull, a subtle but unmistakable shift in the weight of the air. The waterfall seemed louder than usual, as if it was making room in the soundscape for what was coming.
The others woke, gradually drawn out by the change in the atmosphere, the way people are drawn out by anything that disrupts the established pattern of their days.
They came into the basin's open center and stood looking up. Even the children were quiet, something in the quality of the air communicating itself to them, that old pre-linguistic understanding of weather that lives below the threshold of taught knowledge. The first drop hit Vera's upturned face at mid-morning, then another.
Then the sky opened, not a gentle rain.
A real one. The kind of rain that the desert saves up its responses for, that comes after long denial with all the force and volume of everything withheld. It came down in earnest, straight and heavy, filling the basin with the new roar that competed with the waterfall for dominance of the soundscape, drumming on the reed roofs, striking the pool's surface into a chaos of rings, soaking the garden's soil in minutes to a depth that would feed the root systems for days.
The children ran into it. The adults stood in it. Vera stood in it. She turned her face up and let it come down on her, let it hit her forehead and run down her temples and neck, let it soak through her clothes and fill her boots and run down her arms and off her fingertips. She felt it on the carving on her hands, in the calluses, in the specific topography of her palms that had been remade over these months by the work of building and planting and tending. She heard someone laugh, then someone else. The sound built the way rain builds, one drop becoming two, becoming 1,000 individual moments of joy, accreting into something collective, something the whole basin was generating at once. She opened her eyes. Arden was standing 20 feet away, Ren's hand in his, both of them, soaked, looking up at the sky. The old man's face was turned toward the rain, and for a moment he looked not young, not redeemed, not absolved, but present, fully present in the way that the very old and the very young sometimes manage, stripped of the middle life preoccupations that keep most people living slightly outside the moment they're actually in. Corbett caught her eye across the basin. He nodded once. She nodded back.
Silas was grinning, his wide, deeply creased face split into an expression that erased decades, that made him briefly the younger man he had been before the years of standing at the forge had built the careful patience of old age into his features. He caught her looking and spread his arms wide, a gesture that encompassed the rain and the basin, and the laughing people, and the whole improbable fact of all of them being alive in it together. Vera smiled.
She went into the cabin and took the journal from its shelf. She sat at the fire pit. No fire today, the rain making the smoke unnecessary, and the cool air making it unnecessary, and the general abundance of the moment making it unnecessary. And she opened to the last written page. She wrote for a long time. She wrote about the basin's water table and the optimal planting times for the 3 sister crops and the properties of the clay deposits near the pool's east bank. She wrote about the reed matting technique for roofing and the mixture ratio for the clay mortar and the specific angle of the drainage channels Corbett had designed. She wrote about the wild plants and their uses, the ones Selma had identified and the ones Vera had discovered alone in the early weeks. She wrote about what it took to lead people who had been reduced to need, not authority, not superiority, but consistency and clarity, and the willingness to be the person in the room who was not panicking, even when panic was the reasonable response. She wrote about Cinder and what it meant that an animal could know things people didn't, could hold in his body. The memory of a route, the knowledge of a destination, the unwavering orientation towards something that would sustain life. She wrote, pay attention to what the animals know. They are not guessing. She wrote about Harriet Voss and about Emmett, and about the chain of them, Harriet to the mule Emmett, to Cinder Cinder, to Vera Vera, to whoever came next. She wrote this place was not made for one person. Every person who found it in crisis and left it better than they found it. That is the only debt this land collects. Pay it or don't stay. She wrote about forgiveness not as a concept but as an act, a specific and costly act that had to be chosen moment by moment and did not become easier with practice but became more clearly understood. That understanding it was hard was not a reason to withhold it.
that the person who needed forgiving would not always deserve it, that the person doing the forgiving was not doing it for the person who needed it, but for the basin, for the community,
for the unborn future of a place that could not afford to run on old anger. She wrote about Arden without naming him, describing only what she had chosen and what it had cost and what it had returned to her, which was not a restored relationship, but something different, the specific freedom of a person who is no longer carrying someone else's wrongdoing as their own burden. She stopped, read back what she had written, then turned to the very last page of the journal, the blank page after Emmett's entry, the one that had been empty since 1874, and wrote, "She was right. You don't keep this place. It keeps you. If you are reading this, you came here desperate, and you found what you needed, and you are wondering what you owe. You owe nothing to us, to Harriet, or to the boy who came in 1874, or to the woman who came in 1886 and built the south wall and planted the east garden and learned slowly and at great cost what it meant to tend something greater than herself. You owe only the basin. Tend it. Build it better. And when you are ready, not before, but when you are ready, do what we all did. Leave it open. Leave it better. Pass it on." She closed the journal, tied the cord around it the way it had been tied when she found it, carried it to the corner of the cabin where she had found the buried box, went to work with the trowel, opened the earth again. She placed the journal in the box, nestled against the small cloth pouch that now held the seeds she had saved from the harvest. The next generation of Harriet's planting, labeled in her handwriting with the same careful attention Harriet had brought to the original. She added the iron trowel with its replaced handle, still serviceable, better than she'd found it. She added a single folded piece of paper on which she had written the basin's location in terms of landmarks, the canyon formations, the distances, the specific shape of the fissure in the cliff wall, so that the next person to leave could bring others back if they needed to. She closed the box, set it in the earth, covered it, smoothed the soil over it with her palm. Outside, the rain was still falling, lighter now, but steady, the first of what she understood would be several days of it. The drought breaking the way droughts break. Not with a single dramatic storm, but with a sustained, committed return of water to a landscape that had been waiting. She stood in the doorway of the cabin she had rebuilt and looked out at the basin. The waterfall was running stronger than she had ever seen it, fed by the rain above the curtain of it, wider and louder. The pool beneath it raised and roiling with the addition of the falling water everywhere in the basin. The garden rows were dark and gleaming. The new shelter stood solid against the south wall, Corbett's best work. The cooking fire was banked under its covered area, patient until it was needed again. People moved through the rain. Children played in the new streams of runoff that were cutting channels across the basin's floor. Silas was redirecting water away from the foundation of the cabin with the calm pragmatism of an old man who has seen rain before and knows you work with it rather than against it. Selma was checking the garden beds with the focused attention of a woman who has invested in something and is watching over her investment. Corbett was sitting on a stone near the pool's edge, not working for once, watching his daughter chase the water with the complete absorption of a man seeing something he had not taken the time to see enough of. Arden was sitting beside him, not talking, just sitting. Two men on a stone in the rain watching a child play, which was, Vera reflected, sometimes exactly enough. Cinder stood in the center of the basin, his black coat beaded with rain, his muzzle lifted into the falling water with the same pleasure she felt in it herself, the simple animal pleasure of a body receiving what it has been needing. His silver scar caught the light of the cloud-filtered afternoon, permanent and healed and visible. He had led her here, through a crack in the world, and into the place her husband had prepared for her through weeks of solitary surviving into the unexpected complexity of leading people she had not chosen and caring for them anyway. He had done what Emmett had trusted him to do, and what Harriet's mule had done before that, and what the chain of them had always done, held the knowledge in their bodies when the humans around them were too frightened or too broken to hold it for themselves. She walked out into the rain and put her hand on his neck. He leaned into it slightly, the warm, solid pressure of him familiar now as anything in her life had ever been. "We did all right," she told him. His ear swiveled toward her. "Don't argue with me," she said. "We did all right." Above the canyon walls, the clouds moved in their slow and massive way, indifferent to the small human lives arranged beneath them, carrying the rain west toward other dry places, other cracked earth, other people sitting in the dust of what they had lost, and not yet knowing that somewhere in the folded country to the east there was a hidden basin with a waterfall and a garden and a wooden box buried in the corner of a repaired cabin, waiting for whoever needed it most. Waiting as it had always waited, with the patience of stone and the generosity of water and the long, faithful memory of everything that had ever been given and passed on and given again.